Welcome to my channel.
The air in Lochdubh didn't just turn cold, it turned spiteful. A biting wind whipped off the grey expanse of the loch, carrying the scent of peat smoke and the promise of a winter that intended to settle in for a long, miserable stay. PC Hamish Macbeth sat by the peat fire in his police station, which doubled as his home, nursing a mug of coffee that was more chicory and hope than actual bean. At his feet, Lugs, the ugly mongrel with ears that seemed to belong to two different breeds, let out a long, whistling sigh. Hamish echoed it. Across the room, the telephone sat on the desk like a coiled viper. Hamish stared at it with deep suspicion. At any moment, the shrill ring could signal that Detective Chief Inspector Blair had remembered his existence in Strathbane. Worse, it could mean a situation requiring effort. Hamish preferred his situations to involve nothing more strenuous than the delicate art of poaching a salmon from the strictly guarded waters of the local estate, a task he considered a public service in wealth redistribution. "It's too cold for crime, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his soft Highland lilt vibrating in the small room. "Only a madman or a Sassenach would be out in this." As if summoned by the word, the roar of a high-performance engine tore through the quiet of the village street. Hamish stood, his tall, lanky frame unfolding like a carpenter's rule, and moved to the window. A silver Jaguar, looking entirely too clean and too expensive for the mud-spattered roads of Sutherland, had come to a skidding halt outside the Lochdubh Hotel. Out stepped a man who looked as though he had been curated by a London department store. He wore a camel-hair coat that cost more than Hamish earned in a year, and a pair of leather gloves he used to beat the snow off his sleeves with an air of profound personal insult. This was Julian Vane, the new owner of the old Macrae cottage, which he had renamed the Highland Sanctuary, much to the locals' suppressed amusement. Vane had arrived 3 weeks prior with the intention of invigorating the local economy, which mostly involved complaining about the lack of high-speed internet and the quaint but inefficient manners of the postmistress, Mrs. Kennedy. Hamish watched as Vane barked something at a passing Willie Lamont, who was carrying a crate of empty IRN brew bottles. Willie, never one to let a stranger's urgency ruin a good sluggish pace, simply nodded vaguely and kept walking. "He won't last the winter," Hamish predicted. "He's got the look of a man who thinks the mountains are a backdrop for his life, rather than a force of nature that wants him dead." Hamish retreated to the fire. He had a nice piece of venison, gifted by a local who preferred not to discuss where it came from, simmering in a pot. The plan for the day was simple: eat, avoid the telephone, and perhaps walk Lugs just far enough to give the impression of a patrol. But the peace of Lochdubh was a fragile thing, usually shattered by the very people who claimed to seek it. When the telephone finally did scream, Hamish didn't answer it. He knew the sound of a routine check-in. This ring, however, was followed 10 minutes later by a frantic pounding on his heavy wooden door. Hamish sighed, adjusted his salt-and-pepper uniform jacket to look slightly more dishevelled than it already was, and opened the door. Standing there was the hotel barman, his face the colour of sour milk. "It's Englishman Hamish, the one in the big car. He's in the ornamental fountain in the hotel garden, and I don't think he's checking the plumbing." Hamish felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. His day was officially ruined. "Is he dead, then? He's got a frozen trout shoved down his throat, Hamish," the barman whispered, trembling. "And he's stone cold, in more ways than one." Hamish looked at his simmering pot of stew, then at the falling snow. "Right," he said, reaching for his peaked cap. "I suppose I better go and see which trout it was. If it's one of the ones from the Colonel's private stretch, there's going to be a real fuss." Hamish Macbeth trudged through the thickening slush, his boots making a heavy, wet sound against the pavement. Lugs followed at a distance, his mismatched ears flattened against his head as if he too resented the intrusion of a homicide upon his afternoon. The Lochdubh Hotel, a sturdy grey building that had seen centuries of Highland weather, looked particularly grim under the leaden sky. A small huddle of locals had already gathered near the ornamental garden, their breath rising in white plumes as they whispered with that morbid curiosity unique to small villages. They parted like the Red Sea for Hamish, though the respect was tempered by their knowledge that he was one of their own, a man who would rather be fishing than filing reports. The fountain was a ridiculous Victorian monstrosity featuring a stone salmon leaping out of a basin. Now it featured something far more grotesque. Julian Vane was slumped over the edge of the stone rim, his expensive camel hair coat soaked through with icy water and turning a darker, muddier shade of brown. His designer trousers were hitched up, revealing pale, spindly ankles, but it was his face that commanded the most attention. His eyes were wide, fixed in a permanent expression of aristocratic outrage, as if he were about to demand to speak to the manager of the afterlife. Protruding from his mouth was indeed a large, frozen brown trout. The tail fins flickered slightly in the biting wind, giving the corpse a surreal, mocking appearance of life. Hamish stood over the body, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't touch anything, he simply looked, his hazel eyes taking in the details that a more frantic investigator would miss. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate slush, which suggested the snow had covered the tracks, or the killer had been very careful. Vane's leather gloves were still on his hands, but one was torn at the thumb. Hamish noted the position of the trout. It had been forced in with considerable strength, likely after Vane was already incapacitated. It was a humiliating death, a theatrical statement of local loathing. In the Highlands, being choked with a fish was a very specific kind of insult. It was the mark of a gillie's revenge or a poacher's dark joke. "It's a fine fish," a voice croaked. Hamish turned to see Angus Macpherson, the local draper and a man whose capacity for gossip was only matched by his capacity for malt whisky. £6 if it's an ounce, though I doubt Julian here is appreciating the quality of the flesh. "Keep back, Angus," Hamish said softly, though there was no real steel in his voice. "And tell the others to move along to the bar. There's nothing to see here but a cold man and a wasted dinner." "Is it a murder, Hamish?" Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, asked, her eyes darting toward the silver Jaguar parked nearby. "Or did he just have a very unlucky accident while trying to eat raw?" "It's a murder, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish sighed, looking up at the darkening sky. "You don't usually find a frozen fish at the back of a man's throat by accident." Not unless the fish was feeling particularly ambitious. He knew what was coming next. The protocol for a death of this nature in a sleepy village like Lochdubh meant that the big hitters from Strathbane would be summoned. The peace of his police station would be replaced by the heavy-handed arrogance of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Hamish felt a weary pang of regret for his venison stew, which was surely drying out on the stove by now. He leaned down slightly, sniffing the air around Vane. Beneath the scent of wet wool and the fishy tang of the trout, there was something else, a faint, cloying smell of expensive perfume, something floral and heavy, like lilies in a funeral parlour. It didn't match the rugged, outdoorsy image Vane had tried to cultivate with his sanctuary. "Hamish, you have a lazy streak of nothing." The roar shattered the atmospheric silence of the garden before the man even came into view. A fleet of black police cars screeched into the hotel driveway, spraying slush over Willie Lamont's empty bottles. Out of the lead car, DCI Blair exploded. He was a man who appeared to be composed entirely of high blood pressure and cheap polyester. His face was already a vibrant shade of beetroot, and his small, pig-like eyes were fixed on Hamish with practiced loathing. Behind him trailed his usual sycophants, Detectives Anderson and MacNab, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else than in the presence of their superior's impending coronary. "Look at you!" Blair bellowed, stomping toward the fountain. "Standing there with your hands in your pockets while a taxpayer lies dead in a bird bath. Why haven't you secured the perimeter? Why isn't the body covered? I've seen more professional conduct from a traffic warden on his first day. It's a fountain, sir, not a bird bath," Hamish said mildly, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic Highland drawl that he knew drove Blair into a frenzy. And I didn't want to disturb the evidence. The fish, you see. It's a very specific piece of evidence." Blair looked at the corpse and let out a bark of laughter that lacked any mirth. "A fish? You're telling me a man's been killed with a fish? This is what happens in this backwater. You people are savages. It's obviously a local job. Some poacher got his feelings hurt because the Sassenach complained about his sheep." He turned to Anderson. "Get the local poaching records. I want every man who owns a rod or a net questioned by nightfall. We'll have a confession before the pubs close." Hamish watched as Blair's team began to trample over the garden, obliterating any subtle tracks that might have remained in the slush. Blair was already pointing a thick, trembling finger at Willie Lamont, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "You, what's your name? You look like you know your way around a trout. Where were you an hour ago?" Hamish stepped back, fading into the shadow of a large rhododendron bush. He knew better than to interfere when Blair was in a law and order mood. The DCI would bully the locals, shout at the wind, and eventually arrest someone like poor Willie because he had a muddy coat and a confused expression. Meanwhile, the real killer was likely sitting somewhere warm, perhaps still smelling of lilies, watching the snow fall. Hamish looked at Vane's torn glove one last time. It wasn't a tear from a struggle. It looked as though something had been snatched from his hand. "Are you going to just stand there, Macbeth?" Blair yelled, noticing Hamish's retreat. "Go and make yourself useful. Go and find me a witness who isn't a simpleton. Or better yet, go get me a coffee. And make it quick, you Highland sheep-shagger." Hamish touched the brim of his cap in a mock salute. "I'll see what I can find, sir. Both the witness and the coffee." As he walked away from the chaos of the crime scene, his mind was already turning over the oddities. Vane had been a man of many enemies, but the frozen trout suggested a cold, calculated premeditation that didn't fit a sudden outburst of village temper. A frozen fish had to be prepared. It had to be kept in a freezer until the moment was right. It was a weapon that melted away, leaving only the humiliation. Whistled low for lugs and headed toward the back entrance of the hotel. If there was any truth to be found in Lochdubh, it wouldn't be found under Blair's spotlight. It would be found in the kitchens and the quiet corners where the tea was poured and the real secrets were kept. Hamish slipped through the service entrance of the Lochdubh Hotel, leaving the cacophony of DCI Blair's barking orders behind him. The transition from the biting, salt-rimed air of the garden to the humid, yeast-heavy warmth of the kitchens was like stepping into another country. Here, the walls were thick enough to muffle the sirens, and the air smelled of roasting mutton and floor wax. At the centre of this sanctuary sat Mrs. Wellington, the hotel's cook, a woman whose girth was as formidable as her memory for local transgressions. She was currently battering a piece of dough with a rolling pin, as if it had personally insulted her clan, but she paused when she saw the tall, red-haired policeman and his scruffy companion. Without a word, she gestured to a stool and poured a mug of tea so strong it looked like liquid peat. "Blair's outside, then?" she asked, her voice a low rumble. "I heard the shouting. I expect they could hear him in Leg if the wind was right. A terrible man, Hamish. He has the manners of a rutting stag and half the senses." Hamish took a grateful sip of the tea, feeling the heat travel down to his frozen toes. "He's in a fine state, Mrs. Wellington. He's decided it's a local poacher because of the fish. He's currently trying to frighten Willie Lamont into admitting he can freeze a trout with his bare hands." He leaned back, his eyes roaming the kitchen with deceptive casualness. "It's a strange thing, though, to go to the trouble of freezing a fish just to use it as a gag. It speaks of a certain planning. Cold heart to match bait temperature." Mrs. Wellington snorted, flour puffing up from the table like a miniature cloud. Julian Vane didn't need a poacher to hate him. He was a man who collected enemies like other men collect stamps. "Did you know he tried to sue the church?" said the Sunday bells interfered with his creative mindfulness. The minister was polite, of course, but the session was ready to drum him out of the county. And then there's the matter of the sanctuary staff. He raised 2 girls from London to act as his housekeepers, but they didn't last a week. Said he was a perfectionist, which is just a fancy word for a bully who likes to see people cry over a dusty baseboard. Hamish nodded slowly, absorbing the information. And who's looking after the place now? He wouldn't be scrubbing his own floors, not with those soft hands of his. He hired locals in the end. Out of necessity, Mrs. Wellington said, leaning in closer. Young Morag from the village. She's a good worker, but she's been coming in here for her breaks looking like she's seen a ghost. She told me Vane was expecting a visitor this weekend. Someone important. He'd ordered cases of that bubbly wine that cost more than a decent cow, and he was in a proper lather about the dusting. But when I asked her who was coming, she went quiet. Scared quiet, Hamish. Not just the boss is a crank quiet. Lugs let out a soft woof, nudging Hamish's leg. Hamish reached down to scratch the dog's tattered ear, his mind clicking through the possibilities. A secret visitor, a floral scent on a dead man, and a frozen fish. The pieces were jagged and didn't yet fit. He thought of the perfume he had smelled by the fountain. Lilies. It had a heavy, old-fashioned scent, not the kind of thing a young girl like Morag would wear, nor was it the sharp, citrusy cologne Vane usually favoured. It suggested a woman of a certain age and a certain standing. Was there any woman seen about the hotel today, Mrs. Wellington, aside from the usuals? Someone perhaps a bit grand, smelling like a florist's shop on a hot day? The cook paused, her rolling pin suspended in mid-air. Now that you mention it, there was a car, a dark blue thing, very discreet. It was parked round the back near the old stables this morning. I thought it belonged to one of the fishing parties, but no one came in for breakfast, and when I went out to empty the bins, I saw a woman walking toward the garden. She was wearing a veil, Hamish. In this day and age, I thought she was a widow headed for the kirk, but she turned off toward the ornamental walk. Hamish stood up, the tea having done its job. The investigation was moving, despite Blair's best efforts to anchor it in the mud of his own incompetence. I think I'll take a wander up toward the sanctuary, Mrs. Wellington. It might be that Morag is there now, and she might be feeling more talkative with the master of the house, currently cooling his heels in a fountain. Be careful, Hamish, the cook warned. There's a nastiness in the air today that the snow won't cover. Vane wasn't just disliked, he was feared by some. He had a way of finding things, financial things. He was a consultant, or so he said, but in my day we called that a nosy Parker with a ledger. Hamish stepped back out into the hallway, avoiding the main lobby where he could hear Blair's voice rising to a crescendo of insults directed at the hotel manager. He slipped out a side door and began the climb up the hill toward the Macrae cottage. The snow was falling more heavily now, draping the Highland landscape in a deceptive shroud of purity. To a stranger, the white hills looked peaceful, but Hamish knew that the snow merely hid the peat bogs and the jagged rocks that could break a man's leg in an instant. As he walked, he thought of frozen trout. To have a frozen fish ready, one needed a freezer near the crime scene. The hotel had freezers, certainly, but they were guarded by Mrs. Wellington. Vane's house had a freezer, or perhaps the killer had brought it in a cool box, a grimly prepared instrument of execution. The choice of weapon was so deliberate, so theatrical, that it felt like a performance. It wasn't just a murder, it was a critique. Halfway up the path he spotted something caught in a gorse bush. He leaned over, his long fingers plucking a small scrap of fabric from the thorns. It was a thread of silk, dyed a deep, royal purple. It was far too fine for a villager's work clothes and too delicate for a hiker's gear. He tucked it into his pocket, his mind already drifting toward the big house on the hill, the Halberton Smythe estate. Priscilla would be there, and Priscilla always knew which grand ladies were visiting the Highlands and which of them had a penchant for purple silk and funeral lilies. The romantic complication of his life was about to become a professional necessity, a prospect that made Hamish feel more tired than the climb. He needed more than tea for what was coming. He needed the kind of insight that only someone who moved in Vane's social circles could provide. The climb toward the Halberton Smythe estate was a weary one, the kind of trek that made Hamish's long legs ache with the damp cold of the Highlands. The wind whistled through the Scots pines, a lonely, high-pitched sound that seemed to mock the tidy order of the valley below. As he reached the iron gates of the big house, the snow began to settle in earnest, turning the driveway into a white carpet that muffled his footsteps. He felt a familiar twinge of unease. Dealing with the gentry was always a delicate business. They had a way of looking at a village policeman as if he were a particularly interesting piece of local folklore, rather than an officer of the law. But Priscilla Halberton Smythe was different, or at least Hamish liked to tell himself so during his more optimistic moments. He found her in the morning room, a space of faded elegance filled with the scent of beeswax and old books. She was standing by the window, a cup of Earl Grey in her hand, looking out at the encroaching white. When she turned, her pale aristocratic face lit up with a genuine warmth that always made Hamish feel simultaneously hopeful and entirely inadequate. She was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater, the colour of a Highland loch under a summer sun, and for a moment the grim image of Julian Vane and his frozen trout felt like a fever dream from another world. "Hamish," she said, her voice a calm melody against the rattling of the window panes. "I heard the sirens. I take it our new neighbour has finally managed to annoy someone to the point of no return. The village is already buzzing with the most extraordinary rumours about a fish." Hamish took off his cap and stood by the door, feeling the mud on his boots was an affront to the Persian rug. "It's more than a rumour, Priscilla. Mr. Vane is dead, and it wasn't a peaceful passing. He was found in the hotel fountain with a frozen trout where his breath ought to be. It's a nasty, mocking business." Priscilla's expression didn't shatter into horror. Instead, it sharpened into a look of intense, analytical interest. She set her teacup down with a precise click. A frozen trout. How very specific. Julian was a man who prided himself on his palate, you know. He once sent back a bottle of wine at the hotel because he claimed someone with a grudge had harvested the grapes. He was insufferable, Hamish, but he was also deeply connected. He wasn't just a consultant. He was a man who knew where the bodies were buried. Figuratively speaking, of course. Hamish moved closer to the warmth of the hearth, Luggs settling himself with a grunt onto a velvet footstool before anyone could object. "I found a scrap of purple silk on the path near his house, Priscilla, and there's a scent of lilies at the scene. Mrs. Wellington saw a woman in a dark blue car, wearing a veil, heading toward the garden earlier today. Does that ring any bells in your circles? Someone who might have a reason to want Vane silenced in such a public, humiliating way?" Priscilla walked over to a small mahogany bureau and began leafing through a stack of invitation cards. "Purple silk and lilies. It sounds like a Victorian melodrama. But wait." She pulled out a stiff, cream-coloured card with a gold crest. "There was a party in Strathbane last night. Lady Catherine Drax was there. She's an old friend of my father's, though friend is perhaps too kind a word. She's a formidable woman with a penchant for high church aesthetics and very expensive, very traditional perfumes. She also happens to be a major shareholder in several of the firms Julian was consulting for." "Lady Catherine," Hamish repeated, the name tasting of old money and cold steel. "And would she have a reason to be wandering around Lochdubh in a veil, carrying a frozen fish?" "She has a reason to be terrified, Hamish," Priscilla said, her eyes meeting his. "There have been whispers for months that Julian was preparing a dossier. He called it his life insurance. It was supposedly a record of certain irregularities in the way the county's land grants were being handled. If that dossier exists, it would ruin more than just Lady Catherine. It would dismantle half the established families in the north. Julian wasn't just a nuisance, he was a blackmailer who dressed it up as corporate transparency." Hamish sighed, the weight of the case growing heavier. A local poacher killing a Sassenach over a fishing dispute was the kind of crime Blair could understand, the kind of crime that would stay in the village and be forgotten in a year. But a conspiracy involving land grants and titled ladies was a different beast entirely. It was the kind of case that brought in the big guns from Edinburgh, the kind that got a man promoted and moved to a grey office in the city. He looked at the purple thread in his hand. It was a tiny thing, but it was a link to a world far removed from the simple life he carried. "I need to see that dossier, Priscilla. If it was at the sanctuary, it's likely gone by now. But Vane was a cautious man. He wouldn't keep all his eggs in one basket, especially not a basket as flimsy as a glass-fronted cottage. He had a locker at the club in Strathbane, Priscilla noted, and a safe in his London office. But if he was expecting a visitor here, he might have had it on him, or hidden somewhere local. He had a torn glove, Hamish said, remembering the detail from the fountain, as if someone had snatched something from his hand. But the trout... That's the part that still bothers me. If you're a grand lady like Catherine Drax, you hire someone to do your dirty work. You don't go lugging a frozen fish through the snow yourself. It's too personal, too messy. Unless, Priscilla added softly, you wanted to make sure he died in a way that made him look like a joke. Julian's greatest fear wasn't death, it was being laughed at. To be found gagged with a fish in a common hotel garden. It strips him of all his power. Even in death he's a punchline. Hamish nodded, his mind working through the geography of the village. If the woman in the veil was Lady Catherine, where had she gone? The dark blue car hadn't been seen leaving the village, and with the snow getting worse, the roads were becoming treacherous. He thanked Priscilla, his gaze lingering a second too long on her, before he remembered himself and called for lugs. As he stepped back out into the cold, the wind had died down, replaced by a heavy, silent fall of large flakes. The world was disappearing under a white shroud, and Hamish knew he had to move fast. Blair would be reaching the end of his patience with the locals. Once the DCI started making arrests to satisfy his own ego, the truth would be buried deeper than the Lochdubh roads. He needed to find Morag, the housekeeper. She was the one who knew the rhythms of the sanctuary, and she was the one who had seen Vane's fear firsthand. The descent from the Halberton's Smythe estate was swifter than the climb, but no less treacherous. The snow was no longer merely a nuisance. It had become a thick, muffling blanket that transformed the familiar silhouettes of the Highland pines into ghostly, unrecognizable shapes. Hamish kept his chin tucked into the collar of his uniform, his thoughts churning as rapidly as the white eddies around his boots. Priscilla's mention of the dossier had changed the flavour of the case entirely. It was no longer a matter of a local grievance or a hot-headed dispute over a fence line. It was about the kind of secrets that could topple the comfortable, old-money foundations of the North. As he reached the village level, the blue light of a police cruiser pulsed rhythmically against the white walls of the Lochdubh Hotel, a reminder that DCI Blair was still there, likely making life miserable for anyone within shouting distance. Hamish avoided the hotel front, instead cutting through the narrow alleyways that led toward the cluster of cottages where the local workers lived. He was looking for a small, whitewashed dwelling with a bright red door, the home of Morag Mackenzie. Morag was a quiet, industrious girl with a tendency to blush at the slightest provocation, the sort of girl who would find Julian Vane's aggressive modernity utterly terrifying. As he approached, he noticed that no smoke was rising from her chimney, a worrying sign in this weather. In the Highlands, a cold hearth in midwinter usually meant someone was either away or hiding. He knocked softly on the red door, the sound swallowed by the thick air. There was no answer. Lugs, however, began to whine, his nose pressed against the threshold. He gave a sharp, authoritative scratch at the wood. After a moment, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back reached Hamish's ears, and the door creaked open just a few inches. Morag's face appeared in the gap, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair a tangled mess that suggested she had been pulling at it in distress. When she saw the tall, familiar form of the village constable, she let out a sob that was half relief and half terror. "Oh, Hamish," she whispered, pulling him inside and slamming the door shut with a frantic strength. "The man from Strathbane, that Inspector Blair, he's been here. He was shouting and throwing things. He said if I didn't tell him which of the village boys Mr. Vane was fighting with, he'd have me in the cells for obstruction. I didn't know what to say. I don't know anything about village boys." Hamish took off his cap and sat at the small kitchen table, gesturing for Morag to sit opposite him. "Peace, Morag. Blair has a way of making the innocent feel like criminals. It's the only way he knows how to work. Just take a breath and tell me what's really been happening at the sanctuary." "Mrs. Wellington said you were looking like you'd seen a ghost lately. Was it Mr. Vane you were afraid of, or the people who were coming to see him?" Morag twisted a damp handkerchief in her hands, her knuckles white. "It was the atmosphere, Hamish. It was like living in a pressure cooker. Mr. Vane, he wasn't just a rude man, he was a desperate one. He spent all night on the telephone, arguing with people in London, shouting about leverage and settling accounts. And then there was the freezer." Hamish sat up a little straighter. "The freezer, Morag?" "He bought a new one," she said, her voice trembling. "A small chest freezer for the pantry. But he wouldn't let me touch it. He said it was for specialist biological samples for his consultancy work. But I saw him one night, Hamish. I came back because I'd forgotten my scarf, and the kitchen lights were on. He was standing there with a large fish, a trout, and he was wrapping it in purple silk. He looked possessed. He was talking to the fish, Hamish. He said, 'You're going to be the guest of honor, my beauty. We'll see how she likes the taste of reality.'" Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Highland wind. The frozen trout hadn't been the killer's idea, it had been the victim's. Vane had intended the fish to be a grotesque message or a prop in his blackmail scheme. The purple silk Hamish had found on the path wasn't a scrap from a killer's garment, but the wrapping for the weapon itself. "And the visitor?" Hamish asked quietly. "The woman in the veil?" "She came this morning," Morag said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A big blue car. He told me to go home early and said he had sensitive negotiations. But as I was leaving, I saw her. She didn't look like a lady coming for tea. She looked like an executioner. She was wearing a long purple coat and a hat with a heavy veil, but I could see her hands. They were shaking, Hamish. She wasn't carrying a handbag, she was carrying a heavy leather folder. The dossier, I think. Did you hear them speak?" "Only a little. I was hiding by the gatehouse waiting for the bus. I heard her scream at him. She called him a parasite and a thief, and then he laughed. That horrible high-pitched laugh of his. He told her that when the snow stopped, she would have no title or penny in her name. He said he'd meet her at the hotel garden to finalize the transfer, because he wanted to see her face in the public light when she handed over the money." Hamish leaned back, the picture finally beginning to clarify in the dim light of the cottage. Vane had lured Lady Catherine to a public place, intending to humiliate her while extracting his final payment. He had prepared the trout as a final cruel insult, perhaps a reference to an old family scandal or a play on her name. But something had gone wrong. The victim's theatrical prop had been turned against him. The executioner had found a way to reverse the roles. "Morag," Hamish said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to stay here. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me, not even Blair, especially not Blair. I have to go back to the hotel. There's something I missed in that fountain, and I suspect it's still there, hiding under the ice." As he stepped back out into the storm, Hamish realized the danger had shifted. If Lady Catherine was as desperate as Priscilla suggested, she wouldn't stop at one parasite. And Blair, in his ham-fisted attempt to arrest Willie Lamont, was providing the perfect smokescreen for a high-society killer to slip away into the white silence of the mountains. Hamish whistled for lugs, his mind racing. The trout wasn't just a gag, it was a container. And if he was right about what was hidden inside that fish, the motive for the murder was far more petty and far more human than a simple land dispute. He began to run, his long legs eating up the distance back to the Lochdubh hotel, hoping that the Sassenach arrogance hadn't already claimed another victim in the form of the truth. The trek back to the Lochdubh hotel felt twice as long as the journey out, the wind now a howling banshee that tore at Hamish's uniform and threatened to steal the very breath from his lungs. The snow had reached a state of blinding intensity, a true Highland whiteout that reduced the world to a spinning vortex of frost. By the time the grey bulk of the hotel emerged from the gloom, Hamish looked like a man made of sugar, his red hair crusted with ice. As he rounded the corner toward the ornamental garden, he saw that the scene had transformed into a theatre of the absurd. Powerful floodlights had been erected, casting harsh, flickering shadows against the stone walls. At the center of the glare stood DCI Blair, looking like a man on the verge of a triumphant stroke. Beside him, looking small and utterly bewildered, was Archie McLean, the village's most inept poacher, a man so clumsy he'd once managed to hook his own ear while trying to cast into a bathtub. Blair was holding a clear plastic evidence bag aloft, shaking it in Archie's terrified face. Inside the bag was a rusted, antique fish smotherer, a heavy wooden tool used to dispatch salmon quickly. It was a local heirloom that had likely been sitting in Archie's shed since Queen Victoria's reign. "Explain this, you bog-trotting simpleton," Blair bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain of his excitement. "We found this in the back of your van. The victim was choked with a fish, and here you are with a specialized killing tool. It's a classic case of local resentment. You didn't like the new master of the sanctuary telling you where you could cast your miserable line, so you decided to give him a taste of his own hobby." Hamish moved into the circle of light, Lugs following with a low, sceptical growl. "Archie couldn't catch a cold in a draught, sir," Hamish said, his voice quiet but carrying through the gale. "And that smotherer hasn't seen the light of day in 10 years. The cobwebs in the bag alone should tell you that." Blair turned, his eyes bulging. "Macbeth, I told you to stay out of my way. While you were off mooching tea and dodging the weather, my boys have been doing real police work. We've got the weapon, we've got the motive, and we've got the suspect. This is an open and shut case. The Sassenach was a bully, and the local peasants snapped. It's as old as the hills themselves. But the fish was frozen, sir," Hamish said, his tone deceptively mild. "Archie doesn't own a freezer. He barely owns a working light bulb. To have a frozen trout ready and waiting, you'd need a bit more foresight than poor Archie has ever shown in his life. He once tried to poach a swan and ended up being chased halfway to Ullapool by the bird." "Details!" Blair screamed, the word lost in a sudden gust of wind. "Minor details. The fish was a symbolic gesture. He probably kept it in a snowbank. Now get out of here before I arrest you for interfering with a murder investigation." Hamish watched as Anderson and MacNab led a weeping Archie toward the police vans. It was a classic Blair maneuver: find the easiest target, manufacture a narrative, and clear the books before the weekend. But Hamish's eyes weren't on the departing vans. They were on the fountain itself. The body of Julian Vane had been removed, leaving only the dark, disturbed water and the stone salmon. He approached the pool, ignoring the screams of the forensics team. The ice at the bottom of the fountain had been shattered during the recovery of the body, and small shards of it were floating on the surface like diamonds. He knelt by the rim, his long fingers dipping into the freezing water. He wasn't looking for a weapon or a scrap of clothing. He was looking for the life insurance Morag had mentioned, the dossier that Lady Catherine Drax had supposedly been carrying. If Vane was as cunning as Priscilla suggested, he wouldn't have just handed it over. He would have used it as bait. Hamish's hand brushed against something hard and flat, wedged deep into the crevice behind the stone salmon's tail. He pulled it out. It wasn't a leather folder. It was a small, waterproof plastic pouch, the kind used by divers to keep documents dry. Inside the pouch was a single laminated photograph and a handwritten note. Hamish tucked it quickly inside his jacket before Blair could notice. He knew that if he handed it over now, it would be lost in the Strathbane evidence locker or dismissed as irrelevant to the case against Archie. He needed to see it in the quiet of his own station, away from the neon lights and the ego of his superior. "What are you doing, Macbeth?" Blair shouted, stomping over. "I told you to clear off. This is a secure site. Just checking the plumbing, sir," Hamish replied, standing up and wiping his wet hand on his trousers. "I wouldn't want the fountain to overflow and ruin your crime scene. It's a very fine fountain, after all." Blair let out a sound of pure disgust and turned his back on Hamish, beginning to bark orders about the final sweep of the garden. Hamish didn't wait for a second dismissal. He whistled for lugs and began the long walk back to the police station. The red herring of Archie's arrest would buy him a few hours of peace, but the clock was ticking. Lady Catherine, or whoever the woman in the veil truly was, would soon realize that the dossier she had snatched from Vane's hand was a decoy. The real evidence, the life insurance, was currently tucked against Hamish's chest. As he walked, the puzzle pieces began to shift in his mind. The frozen trout wasn't just an insult, it was a distraction. Vane had been a man who loved games, and he had invited his killer to a final match in the snow, but the killer had changed the rules, the purple silk, the funeral lilies, the frozen fish. It was all too theatrical, too deliberate. It was as if someone were trying very hard to make the murder look like a Highland legend come to life. And as Hamish reached the safety of his front door, he realized with a start that the most invisible person in the village wasn't a poacher or a grand lady. It was someone who had been watching the whole drama unfold from the very beginning, someone who knew exactly how much a secret was worth in a place like Lochdubh. The heavy wooden door of the police station groaned shut against the Highland gale, cutting off the howl of the storm and leaving Hamish in a silence so thick it felt tangible. He didn't turn on the main lights. Instead, he moved through the shadows to the kitchen, where the embers of the peat fire still cast a low orange glow across the flagstones. Luggs shook himself vigorously, sending a spray of melted snow across the floor, and then immediately took up his position by the hearth, eyeing the pot of stew with hopeful intensity. Hamish, however, had no appetite. He sat at the scarred deal table and pulled the waterproof pouch from his jacket, his hands still numb with the biting chill of the fountain water. He carefully extracted the contents. The laminated photograph was not of a land deed or a secret ledger, but of a sunny afternoon at a Highland Games gathering from perhaps 5 years ago. It showed a younger, less bloated Julian Vane standing next to a woman whose face was partially turned away. In the background, the distinctive profile of the Lochdubh mountains loomed. But it was the note that held the real weight. Written in Vane's cramped, aggressive hand, it read, "The purity of the Highlands is a myth we sell to tourists, Lady C. But the purity of a bloodline? That's a myth you've sold to yourself. One word to the papers about the St. Jude's incident and your precious reputation is as dead as a gutted salmon." Hamish leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The life insurance wasn't about land grants or corporate embezzlement. It was about something far more fragile and, in the eyes of the aristocracy, far more valuable, a social scandal. St. Jude's was a private clinic in the south, one known for discretion regarding nervous breakdowns and unplanned family expansions. Vane hadn't been blackmailing Lady Catherine for money. He had been using her to gain entry into the very circles that had snubbed him since his arrival. He wanted her status, her influence, and her validation. The frozen trout wasn't just a weapon, it was a cruel metaphor for a cold fish aristocrat who thought she was above the common fray. But as Hamish stared at the photograph, he realized something was fundamentally wrong. The woman in the picture was wearing a very specific piece of jewelry, a brooch shaped like a silver thistle with an amethyst heart. It was a distinctive piece, the kind of heirloom that would be recognized instantly in a small community. And he had seen it before, not on a grand lady from Strathbane, but much closer to home. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He thought back to his conversation with Mrs. Wellington in the hotel kitchen. He thought of Morag's description of the woman in the veil, the one whose hands were shaking as she carried the folder. And then he thought of the scent, the heavy, cloying smell of funeral lilies. It was a scent that didn't just belong to Lady Catherine Drax. It belonged to someone who spent their days surrounded by the trappings of tradition and the quiet, stifling expectations of Lochdubh's social hierarchy. It wasn't a land dispute, Hamish whispered to the empty room, and it wasn't about a London dossier. It was about a mother's pride. He stood up, his mind racing through the timeline. Lady Catherine had indeed visited Vane, and she had likely been the one to snatch the decoy folder in her desperation to protect her family's name. But Lady Catherine was a woman of iron will. She would have demanded the documents. She wouldn't have engaged in a bizarre piece of performance art involving a frozen fish. The trout was too local, too specifically Lochdubh. It was the act of someone who knew the village's folklore, Someone who knew that a fish in the throat was the ultimate sign of a silent snitch. He saw the purple thread he had found on the path. He had assumed it was silk from a grand lady's coat, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a thread from a velvet altar cloth. The funeral lilies weren't a perfume choice, they were the scent of the church vestry, where the flowers were kept in cool water before being placed for the Sunday service. The killer wasn't a Sassenach outsider or a desperate aristocrat. The killer was someone who had been invisible because they were so much a part of the scenery. Someone who had a key to the hotel freezers. Someone who knew Vane's schedule to the minute. And someone who had a much deeper, more personal reason to hate the man who was threatening to tear the social fabric of Lochdubh apart. Vane hadn't just been blackmailing Lady Catherine, he had been using a local intermediary to deliver his threats, someone he thought he could control with a few coins and a bit of misplaced patronization. Hamish reached for his coat, his eyes hard. The petty human motive was staring him in the face. It was the desire for a quiet life, the protection of a secret that had stayed buried for 20 years, and the sheer, burning resentment of a servant who had been treated like a footstool for too long. Vane had underestimated the stupid Highlanders, and in doing so, he had invited his own destruction at the hands of someone who knew exactly how to wait for the frost to bite. "Come on, lugs," Hamish said, his voice grim. "We have one more stop to make before Blair sends poor Archie to the cages. We need to go back to the hotel, but not to the garden. We're going to the one place in that building where everyone goes, but nobody truly looks." He stepped back out into the night, the snow now a silent, ghostly presence. The trap was already forming in his mind. He didn't need forensics or a confession under a desk lamp. He just needed to tell a story about a silver thistle brooch and a frozen trout, and wait for the person who knew the ending to finish it for him. The darkness of the Highlands was deep, but Hamish Macbeth knew how to see through the shadows, and he knew that the deadliest predators were often the ones who looked the most like sheep. The snow had reached a depth that made every step an exercise in endurance, but Hamish Macbeth moved with the steady, purposeful gait of a man who knew his terrain. The Lochdubh Hotel was now a beacon of artificial light against the choking darkness of hills. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp wool, spilled ale, and the electric tension of a village under siege. DCI Blair was still in the main lounge, his feet up on a low table, nursing a large whiskey while he regaled a terrified junior officer with the details of how he had broken the case of the poacher's revenge. Hamish didn't head for the lounge. He bypassed the noise and the arrogance, steering lugs toward the small, quiet alcove behind the reception desk that led to the manager's private office and the staff linen room beyond. He found Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, sitting in the small staff snug, ostensibly helping the hotel manager with the redirected mail. She was a pillar of the community, a woman whose life was a series of sorted envelopes and weighed parcels. Beside her sat a large velvet-lined box containing the church's floral arrangements for the upcoming winter gala, tall, waxy white lilies that filled the small room with a scent that was sweet to the point of nausea. Hamish leaned against the door frame, his tall frame casting a long, wavering shadow across the floor. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her hands as she methodically sorted through a stack of papers. Her fingers were steady, but the skin around her nails was raw, as if she had been scrubbing them with something abrasive. "It's a terrible thing about Archie McLean," Hamish said, his voice a soft, conversational purr. "Blair's got him in the van, you know. He's convinced Archie used a fish smotherer to kill Julian Vane. It's a neat theory for a city man. It fits all the boxes. Local man, local tool, local fish. The only problem is the trout itself. I've been thinking about that trout, Mrs. Kennedy. It wasn't a fresh catch. It was frozen solid, and it wasn't just any fish. It was one of the prize-winning browns from the hotel's private display freezer in the cellar." Mrs. Kennedy didn't look up, but her hands paused for a fraction of a second over an envelope. "A tragedy, Hamish. But men like Vane always bring trouble. They think they can buy our history and treat our people like characters in a play. If Archie did it, Perhaps it was a moment of madness brought on by years of being looked down upon. "Aye, perhaps," Hamish replied, moving into the room and picking up one of the lilies. He twirled the stem between his fingers. "But then there's the matter of life insurance. You see, Vane had a photograph of a young woman at the Highland Games, wearing a very distinctive brooch, silver thistle with amethyst heart. It was a gift, I believe, from a very prominent family to a girl they had, let's say, disposed of after a certain incident at St. Jude's Clinic. Vane thought he could use that photograph to force Lady Catherine's hand, but he made a mistake. He didn't realize that the girl in the photograph didn't go away. She came back to Lochdubh. She changed her name, she took a quiet job, and she became a respected member of the village. She became someone that everyone trusted with their letters and their secrets. The silence in the room became brittle. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of Blair's laughter from the lounge. Mrs. Kennedy slowly set the mail down. Her face remained a mask of village propriety, but her eyes were like flints. "That's a very tall tale, Hamish Macbeth. The kind of story a man tells when he's been spending too much time alone in the hills with a dog. It's a story the papers would love," Hamish continued, his voice dropping an octave. "A story about how a pillar of the community was actually the illegitimate daughter of a grand estate, hidden away to save a reputation. Vane was a greedy man, but he was also lazy. He used a local to deliver his threats because he didn't want to get his own hands dirty. He thought he could bully you into being his messenger. He thought you were just a simple woman who would do as she was told for fear of her past being revealed. But he forgot one thing. You've spent 20 years building a life of dignity here, and you'd do anything at all, to make sure that life wasn't turned into a circus for his amusement. You have no proof of any of this," she whispered, her voice finally cracking. "I have the photograph," Hamish said, "and I have the purple thread from the altar cloth you used to wrap the fish. But more importantly, I have a trap. You see, I told Blair I found the real dossier in the fountain. I told him it was in a waterproof bag, and that I'd left it in the station safe while I came back here to get him a coffee. He's so busy celebrating Archie's arrest that he hasn't checked yet. But the word is out, Mrs. Kennedy. I made sure to mention it to Willie Lamont, and we both know Willie can't keep a secret for more than 5 minutes." Hamish straightened, his eyes fixed on her. If someone were to go to the station now, they'd find the door unlocked. They'd find the safe sitting wide open. A person could walk in, take the evidence that links them to the St. Jude's incident, and burn it in the peat fire. Of course, I'd have to be there to see who it was. It would be a very sad thing to see a friend walk through that door, but then, murder is a sad business, isn't it? Mrs. Kennedy stood up. For a moment she looked as though she might strike him, her face contorting with a rage that had been simmering for decades. But then, the mask slipped back into place. "You're a clever man, Hamish. Too clever for this village. You should have been a detective in London. You could have had it all. I have everything I want right here," Hamish said simply. "A warm fire, a good dog, and a village that generally leaves me in peace. It's a pity Mr. Vane didn't understand the value of peace. He thought everything had a price. He didn't realize that some things are priceless." He turned and walked out of the snug, whistling for lugs. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He knew the psychology of the village better than anyone. Mrs. Kennedy was a woman who lived by her reputation, and the threat of the dossier, the real one, which Hamish had carefully hidden back at the station, was a lure she couldn't resist. He stepped out into the snow, the cold air a welcome relief after the stifling floral scent of the hotel. He had set the stage. Now all he had to do was wait in the shadows of his own house and watch as the ghost of a 20-year-old scandal finally came home to roost. The snow would cover many things, but it wouldn't cover the truth once it was dragged into the light of the police station fire. As he walked, he felt a pang of sadness. Mrs. Kennedy had been a friend, in her own distant way. She had sold him his stamps and asked after his health. But she had also killed a man with a frozen fish and allowed poor, dim-witted Archie to take the fall. In the Highlands, justice wasn't always about the law. Sometimes it was about restoring the balance. And as the station house came into view, Hamish saw a dark figure already moving through the whiteout toward his front door. The trap was about to spring, and the piece of Lochdubh was about to be bought at a very high price. The silhouette against the snow was small, huddled, and moved with a frantic, jerky energy that betrayed the cool composure Hamish had seen in the hotel's snug. He watched from the shadow of a large, salt-crusted rowan tree, his hand resting on Lugs's neck to keep the dog silent. The figure reached the station door, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then pushed it open. The hinges gave a low, mournful protest that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the wind. Hamish waited. He counted to 20, giving the intruder enough time to reach the desk, to see the open safe, and to commit to the theft. Then, with a heavy heart, he stepped out of the shadows and followed the trail of wet footprints into his own home. Inside, the station was lit only by the dying embers of the peat fire. Mrs. Kennedy was standing by the desk, her shadow stretched long and distorted across the wall. In her hand was the waterproof pouch Hamish had retrieved from the fountain. She was fumbling with the seal, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. When the floorboard creaked under Hamish's boot, she didn't scream. She simply froze, her shoulders bunching up around her ears like a cornered animal. Slowly she turned to face him, the plastic pouch clutched to her chest as if it were a shield. "I told you the door was open," Hamish said softly, his voice echoing in the small room. He didn't move toward her. He remained by the door, blocking the only exit. "I'd hoped I was wrong, Elspeth. I truly had. I'd hoped you'd go home, lock your door, and let the law take its messy, imperfect course. But the fear of what's in that bag was stronger than your common sense." Mrs. Kennedy's face was transformed. The polite, efficient postmistress was gone, replaced by a woman whose features were sharpened by a lifetime of suppressed resentment and the sudden, sharp edge of panic. "You don't understand, Hamish. You with your easy life and your lack of ambition. You don't know what it's like to have your very existence treated as a shameful secret." Julian Vane knew. He didn't just want my silence, he wanted my soul. He wanted me to grovel every day, to be his link to the families that wouldn't look him in the eye. He told me that if I didn't help him ruin Lady Catherine, he'd put my birth certificate on the front page of the Strathbane Gazette. "So you decided to ruin him instead," Hamish said. His hazel eyes filled with a weary sadness. The frozen trout was smart. It looked like a local feud. It looked like the work of a man like Archie. But Archie doesn't have the keys to the hotel's deep freeze, and he doesn't have the meticulous patience to wait in the garden for the exact moment Vane was distracted by a decoy visitor. You knew Lady Catherine was coming. You knew Vane would be gloating. You lured him to the fountain under the guise of delivering the very documents he'd been using to leash you. "He laughed at me, Hamish," she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. "He stood there in his £1,000 coat and laughed because I was shivering. He called me a useful little peasant. He didn't even see me as a threat. He was so busy looking for the grand lady in the blue car that he didn't notice me coming up behind him with the fish. I froze it 2 days ago. It was as hard as a lead pipe. One blow to the back of the neck was all it took. He entered the water without sound. And then I gave him his final meal. I wanted him to look as ridiculous as he made me feel." She suddenly lunged, not toward the door, but toward the fireplace, intending to throw the pouch into the embers. Hamish, for all his deceptive laziness, moved with the sudden, fluid speed of a hunting cat. He intercepted her mid-stride, his large hands catching her wrists with a firm but bloodless grip. Mrs. Kennedy struggled with surprising strength, a guttural sound of frustration escaping her throat. She tried to kick his shins, her sensible shoes thudding against his heavy boots, but Hamish simply held on, his height and weight making the struggle lopsided and brief. "Give it up, Elspeth," he said, his voice dropping to a stern, authoritative growl. "It's over. The pouch doesn't even have the photograph in it. I moved the real evidence to my jacket before I ever went to the hotel. You're holding a stack of old fishing permits and a recipe for clootie dumpling. I had to be sure. I had to be sure you'd take the bait." The fight went out of her instantly. She slumped in his arms, the plastic pouch fluttering to the floor. Hamish led her to the chair by the fire and sat her down, his heart heavy with the grim necessity of his job. He moved to the telephone and dialed the number for the hotel, bypassing the switchboard to reach the room Blair had commandeered as his headquarters. "DCI, Blair?" Hamish said as the line clicked. "This is Macbeth. I think you'd better get down to the station, and you can let Archie McLean go. I have the killer here, and she's ready to make a full statement." "Aye, sir. The postmistress." "No, sir, it wasn't a poacher. It was a matter of local history." He hung up the phone and looked at Mrs. Kennedy. She was staring into the fire, her eyes vacant. The storm outside seemed to have reached a crescendo, the wind rattling the window panes as if trying to force its way in to witness the end of the drama. Hamish felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He had solved the crime. He had saved an innocent man from a life in prison, and he had protected the peace of Lochdubh. But the cost was destroying one of the few stable figures in his world. "Why the lilies, Elspeth?" he asked quietly after a long silence. That was the only thing that didn't fit the local narrative. It was too grand, too floral. She didn't look at him. "They were for my mother's grave," she whispered. "I went to the church vestry to get them before I went to the hotel. I wanted her to see I finally stood up for us. I thought if I smelled like the church, I'd feel forgiven. I didn't realize the scent would follow me like a curse." Luggs walked over and rested his head on the woman's knee, his tail giving a single, sympathetic thump against the floor. Even the dog seemed to recognize the tragedy of the moment. Hamish stood by the window, watching the sweep of the police headlights that would signal Blair's arrival. He knew what would happen next. Blair would burst in, take all the credit, and spend the next week insulting Hamish's intelligence for stumbling onto the truth. He would be loud, he would be rude, and he would completely miss the human heartbreak at the center of the case. And that was how Hamish wanted it. If Blair thought the arrest was a stroke of luck, or a result of his own pressure on the village, he wouldn't look too closely at Hamish's methods. He wouldn't see the smart man behind the lazy mask. He would leave Lochdubh with his ego intact and his promotion secured, leaving Hamish to the quiet, cold beauty of the Highlands. The snow would continue to fall, covering the footprints of the night's events, and by morning the village would return to its secrets and its silence. "You'll have to come with them when they arrive," Hamish said, turning back to the room. "But I'll make sure they give you a coat. It's a bitter night to be leaving home." "I left home 20 years ago, Hamish," she replied, her voice steady once more. "I've just been pretending to be back ever since." As the first flash of blue light reflected off the frost-covered glass, Hamish reached for his cap. The mystery of the frozen trout was solved, but the darkness of the Highlands remained, a vast and indifferent witness to the petty, desperate lives of those who walked its glens. He had done his duty, and now all that remained was the theatre of the law, a play in which he was content to be nothing more than a minor, forgettable character. The blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the interior walls of the station, turning the modest room into a frantic kaleidoscope of sapphire and shadow. Within seconds, the door burst open with a force that sent a fresh swirl of snow skittering across the flagstones. DCI Blair charged in, his face a vivid, alarming shade of purple that suggested his heart was fighting a losing battle with his temper. Detectives Anderson and MacNab followed in his wake, looking windswept and thoroughly miserable. Blair's eyes darted from Hamish, who was leaning casually against the mantelpiece, to Mrs. Kennedy, who sat as still as a stone monument by the dying fire. "What is this, Macbeth?" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the low ceiling. "I was in the middle of a high-level interrogation with the primary suspect. I had that poacher on the ropes. And you call me down here to tell me you've arrested the woman who handles the village stamps? Have you finally lost the few remaining wits you were born with?" Hamish pushed himself off the mantelpiece, his face a mask of humble, slightly dim-witted confusion. He scratched his head, his red hair standing up in unruly tufts. "I'm sorry to have interrupted your fine work, sir, truly I am. It's just—" Well, Mrs. Kennedy here was overcome with the weight of your brilliant investigation. When she saw the way you were closing the net around the village, she realized there was no escape from a man of your caliber. She came here to throw herself on the mercy of the court, as it were. I just happened to be the one she found behind the desk. Blair's chest expanded like a pufferfish. He looked at Mrs. Kennedy, then back at Hamish, suspicion warring with his bottomless vanity. Is that so? She confessed because of my pressure on the locals. Exactly that, sir, Hamish lied, his Highland lilt becoming more pronounced, more rustic. She saw how you found that fish smotherer in Archie's van, a masterstroke, if I may say so, and she knew it was only a matter of time before you traced the frozen trout back to the hotel cellar. She's told me everything, sir, about the blackmail, the St. Jude's business, and how she used her position to monitor Mr. Vane's correspondence. It was all your groundwork that did it. I've just been sitting here making sure she didn't wander off in the snow while I waited for a real detective to arrive. Blair turned toward Mrs. Kennedy, his expression shifting from rage to a predatory sort of glee. So, Elspeth Kennedy, you thought you could outsmart the Strathbane CID, did you? You thought a bit of ice and a fish would throw us off the scent. I knew from the moment I set foot in this village that there was something rotten behind the polite smiles. I told my men, didn't I, Anderson? I said, look at the ones they trust, that's where the darkness hides. Anderson nodded wearily, catching Hamish's eye for a brief, knowing second before looking away. They both knew who had done the work, but they also knew the price of Hamish's peace. Right then, Blair barked, gesturing to Macnab, cuff her. We'll take her back to Strathbane for a formal recording, and Macbeth, since you've actually managed to be present for a breakthrough for once, you can stay here and secure the scene. I'll be expecting a full, typed report on my desk by Monday. And don't think this makes up for your general incompetence. If you'd been doing your patrols properly, Vane wouldn't have been in a position to be murdered in the first place. Hamish watched as they led the postmistress into the night. She didn't look back. She walked with a strange, tragic dignity, her head held high as she stepped into the back of the police van. As the vehicles pulled away, their sirens silent now, but their lights still cutting through the blizzard, the station returned to its natural state of quietude. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic thumping of Lugs's tail against the floor. Hamish stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the red tail-lights vanish into the white curtain of the storm. He felt a profound sense of relief, though it was tinged with the bitterness of the evening's revelations. By tomorrow the news would spread through Lochdubh like wildfire. The villagers would be shocked, then judgmental, and finally they would settle into a comfortable, long-term gossip about the postmistress's revenge. Archie McLean would be released, likely claiming he had outsmarted the police all along, and the silver Jaguar outside the hotel would eventually be towed away, a metallic ghost of a man who had tried to conquer the Highlands and ended up as a cautionary tale. He closed the door and turned the heavy iron bolt. He didn't want any more visitors, especially not the well-meaning ones who would come looking for the inside story. He moved to the kitchen and checked his stew pot. It had cooked down into a thick, savoury mess, the venison tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a spoon. He poured himself a fresh mug of coffee, real coffee this time, kept for special occasions, and sat down at the table. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the real life insurance pouch. He didn't open it. He didn't have to see photos or notes again. He knew the contents would only bring more pain to people like Priscilla and the other families who had spent decades trying to live down the shadows of their ancestors. He walked to the fire, knelt down, and placed the plastic pouch directly into the heart of the glowing peat. He watched as the plastic shriveled and blackened, the documents inside curling into ash before they could ever be read by eyes that would use them for harm. As the last of the purple silk thread vanished into the flames, Hamish felt Lochdubh's balance restored. The secret was gone, the killer was caught, and most importantly, DCI Blair was so convinced of his own genius that he wouldn't dream of promoting Hamish and taking him away from his beloved mountains. "It's a quiet life we have, Lugs," Hamish murmured, ladling a generous portion of stew into the dog's bowl. and it's a quiet life we're going to keep. Let Blair have headlines and medals. I'd rather have a warm hearth and a clear conscience." He sat back in his chair, the heat of the fire soaking into his bones. Outside, the Highland winter continued its relentless assault, but inside the station there was peace. He thought of the frozen trout and the funeral lilies, and he felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity for Julian Vane. The man had arrived in Lochdubh thinking he was the smartest person in the room, never realizing that in the Highlands the smartest person is often the one sitting quietly in the corner, listening to the things that aren't being said. Hamish sipped his coffee and closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be paperwork, and the day after that there would be the inevitable lectures from headquarters. But tonight the mystery was over. The snow would fall, the loch would churn, and PC Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he belonged. At the end of the road, where the world was old, the secrets were deep, and the law was a matter of common sense rather than cold procedure.